sometimes as a researcher you'll do an interview or you'll spend some time with somebody, and that single person will transform your understanding. It's not necessarily a cumulative thing. Sometimes it's a sort of aha moment, or someone will just give you a bit of information that is really kind of revolutionary in your thinking. And there's a guy here, speed injector, his partner also injected speed, and somehow or other I got in contact with them. I can't remember their address, so I've got no idea whether we'll even drive close to it, but it was somewhere on the estate here. Bearing in mind this is 20 years ago and I'm old and forgetful. This really nicely illustrates, I think, the way there is a sort of wisdom that comes from drug users that is undervalued, and yet it has been critical at a number of points in our understanding of the harm reduction and the responses to it. So this is in 1991. I'm interviewing this guy and I'm talking about needle sharing, which is the sort of research brief, and we have a big focus on that. And he explained to me that he never shares anything. He said it's not he didn't need a leaflet from a drug service or anything. He said it's just a basic hygiene thing. I wouldn't share my knife and fork with somebody else. I don't like the idea of that. And so if I'm injecting, I don't want to share my needle with anybody else. But he said, you know, you're asking the wrong questions anyway, he said, because not many people do share needles, he said. But everybody is sharing their spoons and filters and water, and nobody ever even thinks about that. But if you do think about it, the blood can go from a used syringe into some water, onto a filter, and a little light came on in my head. You know, this guy, I was the researcher, and he was telling me something I'd never considered, something which, in fact, internationally at that time, it seems strange to say it to a modern audience, but back then nobody talked about this issue. There were some American researchers, I'm never sure if I pronounced their names right, Costa, Booth and Wiebel, and they were doing some ethnographic research at the same time and were just picking up on the same issues. But this guy said to me that this was an issue that we should consider, and nobody really was talking about it. It wasn't part of the harm reduction discourse. And the tragedy is that I wrote about it, and you know, there was an article in Drug Link, and we added questions into surveys, and we found that lots of people were doing this, and then people started thinking about what we can do to reduce the sharing of things, distributing cookers, distributing filters and water, and the necessity for that was identified by somebody who will get no credit for it. An intelligent guy, quite clearly, you know, from the conversation that I was having with him, and generally the way he thought about the drug issue. He was one of these characters who, if somebody had got a bit of a drug problem, or was, you know, they would come and ask him and seek some advice from him. So he was one of those, you know, pretty common characters who is, you know, recognised as having some knowledge and skill and compassion, who people rely on when things go a bit tits up. But I've never ever even been able to go back to him and tell him that, you know, it was that conversation here in Vinters that meant that articles got written, that questions got asked in research studies. And so when people talk about peer involvement and the value of the insights that emerge from among drug users, and the importance of them within sort of harm reduction and change, that for me is just a classic case where he'd got it worked out, and he was already taking measures to protect himself and to some extent other people, and the academic community then sort of surfs that hard-won knowledge, and people like me who I'm not embarrassed about making a living out of being a researcher and writing this sort of stuff up, because that's a skill it's work that I do. But I am embarrassed that people who are sort of compelled to remain anonymous because of drug prohibition, from whom I've acquired this knowledge, don't get the credit and acknowledgement that they do, because they're the people who actually recognised it first. In that, and this is just one of many examples of insights that come from among drug users, and that are then communicated through academics, harm reductionists. There's this range of other people, but the original thinking, the insights, often come from specifically within the drug using community themselves. That's not to say that original insights don't come from academics and harm reductionists too. It's two-way traffic, but a lot of the credit should go to people from within the drug using population, and they don't get it, because if you then put your hand up and say, acknowledgements, Joe Bloggs in Vinters Park for pointing this out to me for the first time, that would have been a problematic thing for him in his personal life to have had acknowledged. So so that for me was just one of those real seminal moments where you just suddenly think about things very differently, and then it has a whole ripple of effects out that have influenced your writing and what happens in needle and syringe programs, and how people talk about risk, and how people understand the transmission of a whole range of infections.